The morning sun filters through the imposing courthouse windows as Judge Michael Bennett adjusts his wire-rimmed glasses, scanning the day's docket. His clerk notices his usual pre-court ritual, straightening his bow tie while muttering each defendant's name under his breath. A framed photo of his mother sits on his desk, her warm smile a stark contrast to his stern courtroom demeanor. The leather of his chair creaks as he leans back, taking in the weight of today's cases. 20 years on the bench have taught him that every case, no matter how routine it appears on paper, carries its own gravity. His fingers trace the edge of his nameplate. The Honorable Michael Bennett, a title that still feels heavy with responsibility even after all these years. Sarah, his trusted clerk of 15 years, approaches with a fresh cup of coffee. Steam rises from the Atlanta Judicial Circuit mug, a gift from his first year on the bench. She knows his preference: black, no sugar, strong enough to stand a spoon in. As she sets it down, she hesitates, her hand lingering on a particular file in the stack. "Something interesting in today's lineup, Sarah?" Bennett asks, noticing her unusual behavior. "Property dispute, Your Honor." But the defendant. Sarah pauses, shuffling through the papers. She's a doctor, pediatrician. Not our usual property case demographic. Bennett nods, reaching for the file. Property disputes have become increasingly common in Atlanta's rapidly gentrifying neighborhoods. He's seen everything from petty fence arguments to complex historical ownership claims. But as he opens this particular file, something about the address catches his eye. Peachtree Battle Avenue. The same street where he spent his childhood summers. The courthouse begins to stir with life around him. The familiar sounds of security guards greeting the morning shift, elevator doors chiming, and the distant echo of footsteps in the marble corridors create the symphony he's grown accustomed to. Yet today, something feels different. There's a heaviness in the air he can't quite place. He reviews his calendar once more. 3 property disputes, 2 civil cases, and a handful of traffic violations. A relatively light day by his standards. Still, that first case, Turner versus Henderson, keeps drawing his attention back. He flips through the file again, scanning the details. Dr. Jasmine Turner, claiming historical ownership rights dating back to the 1960s. The morning light catches the dust motes dancing in his chamber, reminding him of mornings in his mother's kitchen. She would sit at their formica table, drinking coffee and telling stories about the old days, though some topics were strictly off-limits. The family history had gaps, he knew, spaces where questions went unanswered and names went unspoken. A knock at his chamber door breaks his reverie. It's time. Bennett stands, adjusting his robes with practiced precision. His fingertips brush against his mother's photo one last time. A habit he's developed over the years, a small gesture seeking her approval even now. In the image, she's younger, her smile bright against her dark skin, standing proud in front of their family home. As he makes his way to the courtroom, Bennett maintains his usual commanding presence. Court officers nod respectfully, attorneys straighten their postures, and the morning's nervous energy seems to crystallize around him. Yet underneath his judicial composure, something nags at him. Perhaps it's the familiar street name in that first case, or maybe it's just the weight of another Monday morning. The heavy wooden doors of Courtroom 4B swing open before him. "All rise," the bailiff's voice booms through the chamber. Bennett takes his seat at the bench, surveying the crowd before him. Among the usual faces, attorneys in pressed suits, anxious defendants, bored spectators, he searches for Dr. Turner, though he's not sure why he feels so compelled to identify her before the proceedings begin. "Be seated," he intones, his voice carrying the authority of his position. As the shuffling of feet and rustling of papers settles, Bennett prepares to call the first case. Little does he know, this routine morning is about to become anything but ordinary. Dr. Jasmine Turner rushes into the courtroom, her white coat hastily exchanged for a navy blazer. She's already delivered 2 babies since dawn, and barely made it to her hearing. The property dispute seems trivial compared to her morning, but her grandmother taught her to fight for what's right. As she approaches the stand, Judge Bennett's hand pauses mid-signature, something in her voice tugging at distant memories. The courtroom's artificial lighting casts harsh shadows across her face as she takes her seat beside her attorney, Marcus Reynolds. Her fingers nervously smooth the folder containing decades of property records, deeds, and family photographs. The morning's deliveries, twin girls born 3 minutes apart, had left her exhilarated but exhausted. Now, sitting in this imposing chamber, she feels a different kind of anticipation building. All these years of medical school, and here I am fighting over a property line. She whispers to Marcus, who responds with a reassuring pat on her hand. The dispute had started 6 months ago when her new neighbor, Richard Henderson, began construction on what he claimed was his land that had been in Jasmine's family for generations. Judge Bennett calls the case, his deep voice resonating through the courtroom. Turner versus Henderson, Civil Case Number 2024 CV 4527. As Jasmine stands, she feels the weight of her grandmother's words from years ago. Baby, sometimes the smallest fights carry the biggest meanings. The defendant, Richard Henderson, sits across the aisle with his legal team, his expensive suit and confident demeanor a stark contrast to Jasmine's more modest appearance. She catches him smirking as Marcus presents their opening statement, detailing how the disputed property line cuts through what was once her grandmother's prized rose garden. Your Honor, Marcus begins, Dr. Turner's claim to this property dates back to 1965, when her grandmother, Martha May Wilson, purchased the entire lot. At the mention of this name, something shifts in the courtroom's atmosphere. Judge Bennett's expression changes almost imperceptibly, a slight tightening around his eyes that only the most observant might notice. Jasmine takes the stand, her professional composure momentarily wavering as she feels the judge's intense gaze. She begins recounting the property's history, how her grandmother had saved for years to buy the land, working double shifts as a nurse at Grady Memorial Hospital. The story flows from her lips like a well-worn prayer, each detail preserved through years of family storytelling. The rose garden was her pride and joy. Jasmine testifies, her voice growing stronger. Every Sunday after church, she'd tend to those bushes, telling me stories about our family's history in Atlanta. That garden wasn't just flowers. It was her piece of the American dream. As she speaks, Judge Bennett leans forward slightly, his attention unusually focused. Something about her mannerisms, the way she gestures with her right hand, the slight tilt of her head when emphasizing a point, creates an unsettling sense of familiarity in him. The courtroom seems to fade away as Jasmine describes the day she discovered Henderson's construction crew tearing up the rose bushes. I tried to stop them, she says, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. But they had permits based on his survey, not ours. Those roses were planted by my grandmother's hands. Some things can't be replaced with a court settlement. Henderson's attorney objects, claiming emotional manipulation, but Judge Bennett waved him off. His eyes remain fixed on Dr. Turner, studying her features with an intensity that makes her both nervous and curious. There's something in his expression that reminds her of old family photographs, faces she's seen but can't quite place. The morning proceeds with technical testimony about property surveys and deed histories, but an undercurrent of tension runs beneath the legal proceedings. Each time Jasmine mentions her grandmother's name, she notices Judge Bennett's subtle reactions, a slight pause, a thoughtful frown, a moment of distraction. As the lunch recess approaches, Jasmine can't shake the feeling that this hearing has become about more than just a property line. Something else is unfolding in this courtroom, something that reaches beyond legal documents and survey markers into the complex web of Atlanta's family histories. The courtroom falls silent as Dr. Turner recounts how her grandmother, Martha May Wilson, had originally purchased the disputed land. Judge Bennett's pen clatters to the floor. The name echoes through his mind, bringing back Sunday dinners from his childhood and a faded photograph of two sisters beneath a peach tree. His mother never spoke of Martha May after that summer of '65. Several heads turn at the unusual sound of the judge's pen hitting the marble floor. He apologizes quietly, motioning for Dr. Turner to continue, but his mind is already racing through memories he'd long suppressed. The scent of his aunt's sweet potato pie suddenly feels as fresh as yesterday, and he can almost hear the sound of her laughter mixing with his mother's on their old wraparound porch. My grandmother, Dr. Turner continues, unaware of the storm brewing behind the judge's composed facade, purchased this property after working at Grady Memorial for 15 years. She used to tell me how every extra shift, every holiday worked, brought her closer to owning her piece of Atlanta. Judge Bennett grips the edge of his desk, his knuckles whitening. The timeline matches perfectly. Martha May's purchase of the property coincided with the last time he'd seen her. He was 12 that summer, too young to understand the heated arguments he'd overheard between his mother and aunt late at night, their voices carrying through the thin walls of their family home. Dr. Turner pulls out a yellow document from her folder. This is the original deed, Your Honor. Dated July 15, 1965. The date hits Bennett like a physical blow. July 15, his mother's birthday. The day everything changed. His clerk notices his distraction and quietly approaches the bench. Are you all right, Your Honor? She whispers. Bennett nods curtly, but his eyes remain fixed on Dr. Turner's face, searching for features he should have recognized earlier. The shape of her eyes, the determined set of her jaw, they're mirror images of his mother's. Miss Turner, he interrupts, his voice slightly hoarse. This Martha May Wilson, was she originally from Mechanicsville? The question seems to surprise both the attorneys and Dr. Turner herself. Yes, Your Honor, she responds, curiosity evident in her tone. She grew up there with her sister. She pauses, consulting her notes, but Bennett already knows the name she's about to say. Eleanor, he finishes for her, the word hanging heavy in the air between them. Eleanor Bennett. The courtroom stirs with confused murmurs. Dr. Turner's attorney rises halfway from his chair, uncertainty written across his face. Richard Henderson and his legal team exchange puzzled glances, sensing the shift in the proceedings but unable to grasp its significance. Dr. Turner stares at Judge Bennett, recognition slowly dawning in her eyes. She sees it now, the family resemblance she should have noticed earlier. The same high cheekbones, the same way of tilting their head when deep in thought. Her grandmother's stories about a sister left behind in Georgia suddenly take on new meaning. Your Honor, she begins carefully, are you suggesting? Bennett raises his hand, silencing her. The weight of judicial propriety presses against the sudden rush of personal discovery. Years of training tell him to call for a recess, to recuse himself immediately. But something stronger, something that sounds like his mother's voice, tells him to let this moment unfold. Counselors, approach the bench. He manages, his judicial mask slipping back into place. As the attorneys step forward, he can feel Dr. Turner's eyes on him, probably remembering her grandmother's stories with new understanding. The ceiling fans whir overhead, stirring the heavy air. Through the tall courthouse windows, Atlanta's skyline stretches toward a cloudless sky. The same sky that watched two sisters part ways nearly 60 years ago. In the gallery, the handful of spectators lean forward, sensing they're witnessing something beyond a simple property dispute. Bennett glances at his mother's photo on the bench, wondering if she somehow knew this day would come. The city had changed so much since 1965, but some things, family ties, old wounds, and the weight of unspoken histories, remained constant as the red clay beneath their feet. During recess, Judge Bennett finds himself in his mother's old attic, dust dancing in the afternoon light as he pulls out a weathered cedar chest. Between yellowed papers and old deeds, he uncovers letters addressed to Chicago, all marked "Return to Sender." His hands tremble as he reads his mother's desperate attempts to reconnect with her sister, each letter revealing pieces of a family torn apart. The attic's floorboards creak beneath his feet as he settles cross-legged before the chest, his judicial robes discarded downstairs. He'd called an emergency recess, citing personal matters, and driven straight to his childhood home, now his own residence. The afternoon sun streams through the small window, casting long shadows across stacks of boxes containing decades of family history. His fingers trace the brass latches of the cedar chest, remembering how his mother would sometimes sit up here alone, especially on holidays. He'd catch her wiping tears away when she came down, but she'd always blame it on the dust. Now, as he lifts the heavy lid, that same dust makes his eyes water. At least, that's what he tells himself. The first letter he finds is dated August 1965, just weeks after Martha May left. Dearest sister, his mother's elegant handwriting begins, I know we said things we both regret. The paper is thin with age, the creases so worn they're almost transparent. He finds another from Christmas that same year, then Easter 1966, each one marked with that red, return to sender stamp like a fresh wound. Deeper in the chest, he discovers a bundle of photographs tied with a faded blue ribbon. The first shows two young women in their Sunday best, standing proud before a small house. His mother, Eleanor, tall and elegant, and beside her, Martha May, with the same determined expression he'd seen on Dr. Turner's face in court today. A yellowed newspaper clipping falls from between the photos. Local nurse heads north. The headline reads, with a small picture of Martha May in her white uniform. The article mentions her acceptance to a hospital in Chicago, describing it as an opportunity for advancement. But Bennett knows now there was more to the story. At the bottom of the chest, he finds a legal document that makes his breath catch. A property deed from 1965. Not for Martha May's disputed land, but for this very house he now calls home. His eyes scan the text until he finds what he's looking for. The purchase price, substantially below market value, made possible by a family arrangement. Pieces begin falling into place. The arguments he'd overheard as a child, his mother's insistence on keeping the house, Martha May's sudden departure north. The property dispute in his courtroom isn't just about a modern property line. It's the echo of a decades-old family fracture. He pulls out his phone, pulling up the court records he'd accessed earlier. Dr. Turner's disputed property line runs exactly along where the original family plot would have been divided. Their grandmother's land, split between sisters, now the source of new conflict 2 generations later. A soft chime from his phone reminds him that court will reconvene in 30 minutes, but he can't leave yet. There's one more thing he needs to find. At the very bottom of the chest, wrapped in tissue paper, he discovers what he's looking for, the family Bible. Its leather cover is cracked with age, the gold lettering barely visible. Inside, on pages meant to record births, deaths, and marriages, he finds the entry, Martha May Wilson, departed for Chicago, July 15, 1965. Below it, in shakier handwriting added years later, may God forgive us both. Bennett closes the Bible gently, his judicial objectivity warring with the weight of family history. He has a decision to make, one that will affect not just the property dispute before his court, but the legacy of 2 sisters and the healing of old wounds. The attic feels smaller now, crowded with ghosts and memories and questions that have waited too long for answers. As he carefully returns everything to the chest, he keeps one photo, the sisters beneath the peach tree. Something tells him he'll need it when court reconvenes. The private meeting in chambers feels more like a family confession than a legal proceeding. Dr. Turner stands transfixed before a black and white photograph, her finger tracing the outline of her grandmother's young face. Judge Bennett watches as she pulls out her phone, showing him an almost identical photo from her grandmother's collection, taken moments after his version. The sisters now laughing instead of posing solemnly. I've seen this dress before, Dr. Turner whispers, pointing to the floral pattern her grandmother wore in the photograph. It's still hanging in her closet in Chicago. She never could bring herself to give it away. Her voice catches slightly as she looks up at Bennett, seeing her grandmother's features reflected in his face. The judge's chambers, usually a sanctuary of legal order, feels different today. Late afternoon sunlight streams through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes that dance around them like memories trying to take shape. The formal desk between them seems an unnecessary barrier now, as both struggle to bridge decades of family silence. Your mother, Dr. Turner begins carefully. Eleanor, Grandma Martha kept a photo of her by her bed until the day she died. She reaches into her briefcase, pulling out a worn envelope. She passed last year, but she left this for me. Said I'd know when it was time to open it. Bennett accepts the envelope with trembling hands. Inside, he finds a letter written in familiar handwriting. His mother's, dated just months before she passed away. My dearest sister, it begins, if you're reading this, I finally found the courage to tell the truth, even if too late. I never knew why they stopped speaking. Dr. Turner admits, sinking into one of the leather chairs. Grandma Martha would only say it was about property and pride, and that sometimes the cost of being right is losing what matters most. Bennett moves to his credenza, retrieving a bottle of water for each of them. The formal judge's robes feel constraining now, and he removes them, hanging them carefully on the coat rack. In his suit and tie, he looks less like a judge, and more like what he is at this moment, a man discovering his family's hidden chapters. The property dispute, he says slowly, the one you're fighting now. It's not just about your neighbor's new construction, is it? It's about making sure history doesn't repeat itself. It's not really a question, and Dr. Turner's sad smile confirms his understanding. She pulls out more documents from her briefcase, surveys, deeds, and old photographs of the rose garden that started the current dispute. When Mr. Henderson started building over that property line, it felt like watching our family history being erased all over again. Those roses, she pauses, composing herself. Those roses were planted the day Grandma Martha closed on the property. She said they were a symbol of putting down roots that couldn't be moved. Bennett nods, remembering summer evenings watching his aunt tend those roses, singing hymns under her breath as she worked. He reaches for the family Bible he brought from home, opening it to the family record pages. Dr. Turner, Jasmine, he corrects himself. There's something you need to see. Together, they lean over the Bible, their shadows merging on its aged pages. The entry about Martha May's departure sits stark against the yellowed paper, but below it, Bennett points to something else, a series of crossed-out addresses in Chicago, each one representing his mother's attempts to find her sister. She never stopped looking, he says quietly. And your grandmother never stopped keeping track of us either, did she? Jasmine shakes her head, pulling up another photo on her phone, a recent graduation ceremony at Emory Medical School. In the background, barely visible but unmistakable, stands an elderly woman in a bright blue dress. She came to my graduation, Jasmine reveals. Never said hello, just watched from a distance, said she didn't have the right anymore. The wall clock ticks steadily, marking time as judge and doctor, cousins separated by decades of silence, begin the delicate work of piecing together their shared history. Outside the chambers, Atlanta's afternoon traffic creates a distant hum, but in here, time seems to have paused, giving space for long overdue healing to begin. Over coffee in his chambers, their shared history unfolds like a forgotten quilt. Dr. Turner speaks of holidays spent listening to her grandmother's stories of Georgia red clay and summer thunderstorms. Judge Bennett shares memories of his mother's late-night phone calls to Chicago, when she thought everyone was asleep. Their two lives, parallel for so long, finally intersect in a moment neither could have scripted. She used to say the thunderstorms were different in Chicago, Jasmine says, warming her hands around the coffee mug. Too sharp, too sudden. Not like Georgia storms that roll in slow and steady. She pauses, studying the judge's face. You have her eyes, you know. The same color as my grandmother's. Bennett sets his own mug down, reaching for an old leather album he brought from home. Mother kept everything, he explains, carefully turning pages filled with fading Polaroids. Every Christmas card your grandmother sent, even though they were always returned. Every newspaper clipping about Chicago's first black female hospital administrator. Jasmine leans forward, surprised. You knew about that? About her promotion? Mother had a subscription to the Chicago Defender, Bennett admits. Every week, she'd scan it for news, any mention of Martha May Wilson. She kept a scrapbook. He pulls out a carefully preserved article, the headline announcing her grandmother's historic appointment. The afternoon light shifts in the chambers as they piece together their parallel lives. Jasmine learns about the Sunday dinners her grandmother missed, where an extra place setting remained until Eleanor Bennett's passing. Bennett discovers the secret trips Martha May made to Atlanta, watching her sister's family from afar, too proud or too afraid to bridge the divide. Last Christmas, Jasmine says softly, before she passed, Grandma Martha gave me this. She reaches into her purse, withdrawing a small velvet box. Inside lies a delicate gold locket. When opened, it reveals a tiny photograph of the two sisters as young girls, their arms around each other, laughing at some long-forgotten joke. Bennett's hand trembles as he holds the locket. I remember the day this was taken, he says. It was at the state fair. Aunt Martha had won a blue ribbon for her peach preserves. He chuckles softly. Mother was so jealous. She'd entered the same contest. A comfortable silence falls between them, broken only by the distant sounds of the courthouse. Years of legal training hadn't prepared Bennett for this moment, where the lines between judge and family, past and present, blur into something new and undefined. The property dispute, he says finally. I'll have to recuse myself. Jasmine nods, understanding. But before I do, he continues, there's something you should know about the original property line. He spreads out an old survey map, its edges frayed with age. The rose garden wasn't just your grandmother's symbol of ownership. It was planted exactly on the property line. Half on her land, half on ours. They designed it that way, a shared garden to connect their homes. Jasmine's eyes widen as she studies the map. So when Mr. Henderson's survey shows, it's using modern markers, Bennett confirms. The original boundary stones are still there, buried under decades of growth. Your grandmother's roses marked the true line. Their coffee grows cold as they continue sharing stories, each revelation bringing new understanding. They discover shared traditions. Both families still serve sweet potato pie at Thanksgiving, using the same recipe. Both grew up hearing fragments of stories about the other side of the family, pieces of a puzzle they're only now assembling. As evening approaches, Jasmine pulls out her phone, showing Bennett recent photos of her grandmother's final days in Chicago. She kept a Georgia Pine air freshener in her room. She says, smiling through tears, said it helped her dream of home. Bennett reaches across the desk, taking her hand. The gesture bridges more than physical distance. It spans generations of silence, misunderstanding, and lost opportunities. In his mother's final years, she'd often said that some wounds can only be healed by the next generation. Looking at his newfound cousin, Bennett finally understands what she meant. The truth emerges through their combined memories. A family split not just by distance, but by the complex web of race, property, and privilege in the 1960s South. Dr. Turner reveals Martha May's journey north during the Great Migration, carrying little more than hope and determination. Judge Bennett learns how his own comfortable upbringing came at the cost of his aunt's inheritance. The house on Peachtree, Jasmine says, her voice steady but weighted with history, was supposed to be shared between them. Equal inheritance from their parents. She pulls out another document, this one bearing water stains that look suspiciously like teardrops. Grandma Martha showed me this the day I got accepted to medical school. Bennett raids the yellowed paper. A handwritten agreement between the sisters to co-own their parents' property. But the official deed in the courthouse records tells a different story. His mother's name stands alone on the title, the purchase price well below market value. The banks wouldn't approve a joint loan. Bennett realizes aloud, the pieces finally clicking into place. Not in 1965. Not for two sisters, one married to a prominent doctor, the other single. And he trails off, the weight of historical prejudice hanging heavy in the air. Jasmine nods. So Grandma Martha took her share in cash, headed north where she could buy property on her own terms. She used to say, "Sometimes you have to leave to stay whole." She pulls out a small notebook, its pages filled with her grandmother's careful handwriting. She kept track of every penny she earned, every extra shift, every sacrifice. Not out of bitterness, she claimed, but as proof that we could make our own way. Bennett rises from his chair, walking to the window. The Atlanta skyline has changed dramatically since those days, glass towers reaching toward the clouds where modest brick buildings once stood. "Mother never forgave herself," he says quietly. "She kept your grandmother's share of the money in a separate account, adding to it every month. By the time she passed, it had grown to $357,000. Jasmine finishes. "We know. She sent it all to Chicago when Grandma Martha had her stroke in '98. She joins him at the window. Grandma sent it back. Said some debts can't be paid with money." The late afternoon sun casts long shadows across the judge's chambers as they continue unveiling decades of family history. They discover how both sisters had attended each other's children's graduations, weddings, and major life events, always at a distance, each too proud or too ashamed to make the first move toward reconciliation. "Did you know," Jasmine says, pulling up another photo on her phone, "that Grandma Martha was there the day you were sworn in as judge?" The image shows a crowded courtroom from years ago, and there, in the back row, sits an elegant elderly woman in a purple hat. She said it was the proudest day of her life, even if she couldn't tell you herself. Bennett sinks back into his chair, overwhelmed. All those years on the bench, dispensing justice, while his own family's injustice remained unresolved. "The property line dispute," he says slowly, "your neighbor's construction. It's not just about the roses anymore, is it?" Jasmine shakes her head. "It's about making things right, about honoring both sisters' sacrifices and dreams." She straightens in her chair, her grandmother's determination evident in her posture. "That's why I can't let Henderson build over that line. Those roses aren't just plants. They're our family's testament to survival, to forgiveness, to the hope of reunion." As evening settles over Atlanta, judge and doctor, cousins separated by history, but united by blood, begin drafting a different kind of legal document. Not a property settlement or a court order, but a family covenant, a promise to preserve both the physical boundary of the rose garden and the stories it contains for future generations. Outside, traffic flows along Peachtree Street, cars passing the old family properties without knowing their significance. But inside these chambers, two descendants of determined sisters are finally writing the next chapter of their family story, one that begins with truth and ends with healing. On a warm Saturday afternoon, the old family farmhouse comes alive again. Judge Bennett and Dr. Turner host a reunion that bridges more than just years. Young cousins race across fields their great-grandparents once worked, while elders share stories that were almost lost to time. As evening approaches, two framed photos sit side by side on the porch. The sisters in their youth, and their children, finally reunited, holding hands beneath the same ancient peach tree. Red and yellow roses, newly transplanted from both properties, now line the restored garden path. Richard Henderson stands among the guests, his previous hostility transformed into genuine remorse after learning the garden's history. He'd not only withdrawn his construction plans, but offered to help restore the original rose garden, working alongside Jasmine on weekends to replant what had been lost. Judge Bennett, having officially recused himself from the case, watches from the wraparound porch as family members from Chicago and Atlanta mingle on the lawn. Children who'd only known each other through social media now chase fireflies together, their laughter echoing across the property just as their grandmothers once did. "You know what's remarkable?" Jasmine says, joining him on the porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea. "Every single person here has a piece of the story. Like that cousin over there." She points to a young man setting up his DJ equipment. His mother kept every birthday card Grandma Martha sent, even though they never met in person. The afternoon sun casts long shadows across the lawn as family members gather around tables laden with traditional Southern dishes alongside Chicago specialties. Two sweet potato pies sit side by side, made from the same recipe but bearing subtle differences that speak to years of separate evolution. Near the rose garden, an informal ceremony begins. Bennett and Jasmine had arranged for a permanent historical marker to be placed where the original property line ran. The plaque reads, "Here stood the Wilson sisters' rose garden, a testament to family bonds that survived division, distance, and time. Established 1965, restored 2024. As twilight approaches, Bennett calls for everyone's attention. Standing beside the newly installed marker, he holds up the family Bible. Today, his judicial voice softened by emotion, we're adding new pages to our family history, not just recording births, deaths, and marriages, but celebrating reunions, forgiveness, and new beginnings." Jasmine joins him, carrying the locket with the sisters' photo. Together, they tell the assembled family the full story. The property dispute that separated the sisters, the decades of silent watching and waiting, and the chance courthouse encounter that brought it all full circle. But the most important part of this story, Jasmine adds, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering, isn't about the past. It's about what we choose to do with our inheritance, not just the land or the roses, but the legacy of two sisters who never stopped loving each other, even when pride and circumstance kept them apart. As evening settles over the property, string lights twinkle in the trees, and music fills the air. A blend of gospel hymns the sisters sang in their youth and contemporary songs their grandchildren grew up with. The roses, illuminated by soft lighting, cast delicate shadows on the new marker. The party continues into the night, but Bennett takes a quiet moment to visit his mother's old room. On the bedside table, he places a framed photo of today's gathering, right beside the one of the sisters in their youth. "We did it, Mother," he whispers. "We brought them home." Down in the garden, Jasmine stands among the roses, thinking of her grandmother. A soft breeze carries the mixed scents of peach blossoms and rose petals, and for a moment, she swears she can hear the sisters' laughter in the wind. She touches the family locket around her neck, now containing 3 photos. The sisters in their youth, their children separated by years, and today's reunion beneath the peach tree. As the moon rises over Atlanta, the old property line that once divided a family now serves as the foundation for its reunion, marked not by legal documents or survey stakes, but by a garden of roses that finally blooms whole and undivided.